Hi, this is Bob Murphy, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast. Let's hope this next guest doesn't put you to sleep, am I right?
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm Doug Stewart.
And I'm Nick Gosling.
And today we are joined by a man who needs no introduction, Dr. Bob Murphy. Bob Murphy has a PhD in economics from New York University, and he's the author of many books on economic theory and libertarianism. He is a research assistant professor with the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University, and he blogs regularly at his website, consultingbyRPM.com. Bob is pretty well known for many, many superpowers, but today he is going to be joining us to talk about one of them, and that is how to convince people that society could work without the state. You think you can pull that off in an hour, Bob?
I'm going to try.
Bob, most of our listeners are adherents to the Austrian school, but, one of the things that I think as libertarians we run into a lot are people who profess to be some type of conservative, and they're like, yeah, I like the free market, and I'm a capitalist. But for some reason, they always stop short of following that through to its full conclusion. For example, why not have a free market in police services and defense and law and roads and all these other things that for some reason people think just can't be supplied by the market? It must come from the state. So to start us off is kind of laying the groundwork. What do you consider and what has historic Austrian thought considered to be kind of the fundamental rules of economics that just apply to market interactions? And from that, what is the true definition of pure capitalism?
Okay, sure. So I think Austrian economists, and here, these aren't particularly Austrian insights. I think a lot of other schools of thought would share them to some degree, but we can all recognize the inherent drawbacks to providing services, via a monopoly. That in general, if you have competition in an industry, that's going to keep prices down, that's going to have quality be up, and it's going to protect consumers and employees from, arbitrary power trips by the people who are running the show. And so that's, among other reasons, that's why there's a prima facie case against having the state monopoly in courts and police protection and military defense. If you wouldn't trust the state to be in charge of TV production, or you wouldn't want them to be in charge of pizzas, because the pizza's probably the quality would go down, and then they could lean on you and say, hey, you better do what we say. If you criticize the government, no more pizza for you, right? If that's the kind of thing, and you realize that would be true. Who would want the government to have a monopoly on something like pizza? And then, okay, well, if you can't trust them with that, but you're going to trust them with nuclear weapons, you're going to trust them to decide whether you're guilty of homicide or not. Or you're going to trust them to come to your house when someone's breaking in. And so these are serious, weighty issues. And so obviously the fact that, competition, monopoly, those are important in any sector. So here too, these are life and death issues. Those things are true in this sector as well as other ones. Another main thing in terms of just Austrian economics is Mises' critique of socialism, right? Saying that, in his exposition, not talking about courts or military defense, just in general, talking about economics, Mises was saying the fundamental flaw with socialism, put aside issues about incentives, put aside, concerns about the corruption of power and so on, even if the central planners honestly wanted to help their subjects, they were just completely benevolent, and even if they had access to all the experts in terms of engineering knowledge and physical facts and technology and so on, nonetheless, Mises argued, they would be unable to rationally allocate resources, because if it was true socialism, there wouldn't be markets for the means of production. You wouldn't know how much an acre of farmland was worth relative to a barrel of crude oil or relative to that factory down the street or what have you. And so they wouldn't be able to look at an enterprise that was consuming inputs in order to create goods and services and be able to tell, is this a good use of those resources? They would have no way of reducing the inputs and the outputs to a common denominator. So in a market economy, of course, the way that happens, you get around this problem, is through prices. And so the business owner can ask the accountant every quarter, hey, how did we do? Did we turn a profit or not? And so that's the measure of, are we using resources efficiently in a market economy? But under socialism, you wouldn't have that. So I just applied that same insight that Mises had to goods and services in general to the particular areas of the things we're talking about today, namely police protection and military defense, that without market prices in those services, the central planners, in effect, they're like socialism in those particular sectors. And so just like socialism doesn't work when it comes to TVs and cars and so forth, it also doesn't work very well when it comes to protecting you from burglars or keeping foreign armies out. So in that respect, would you say that basically any system of state, no matter how quote unquote limited it may be, is essentially just a shade of socialism? So in other words, we have, even if we did have a constitutionally limited government in the United States, which, that's just a joke these days, but even if we did, that would you say that's still a form of socialism to some degree, and therefore anywhere the state exists, there cannot be a true free market? Well, one thing is, Murray Rothbard one time asked Mises, and he said, hey, we can see there's obviously gradations of government intervention, and some places are pretty close to a free market, other places are outright socialism, like the Soviet Union, top-down central planning. There's welfare states of Europe. And what Mises told him is, he said that he thought the crisp line between like a market economy that just had a really excessive intervention, but it was still a market, versus just, no, this is socialism. He said, is there a stock market that if the authorities let people have ownership claims in corporations, then the people ultimately own the means of production, and it was just heavily regulated. So that's, I'm not directly answering your question. I'll now turn to that, but I just want to have that framework that in terms of the general question of, can you draw a sharp line? That was the one that Mises gave. So what I'm saying is, you can have a limited state, like the United States as of 1905 or something. I wouldn't say, oh yeah, that was basically socialism. That's not what I would say. But I would say, if you understand why socialism is a general economic system doesn't work, and it would be, a horrible way of producing cars and houses and food for your people. Well, the same problems that plague socialism on a grand scale are still there. If you just say, oh, okay, instead of producing cars and food and houses, let's just let the politicians and the bureaucrats and so on, they'll just provide military defense in the legal system and the prison system and stuff like that. And I say, well, the same problems are there. So I think the burden of proof is on the person who wants to defend that system to explain why all the problems that we know are there in any other good or service for some reason either aren't there, or they're still there, but there's other considerations that trump those factors.
Well, it seems like some of the considerations that may trump those factors would be, they don't believe that the price mechanism would work well in those situations of defense, or that these kinds of things are non-rival. They're, sort of common good uses rather than something letting the price mechanism work.
Right. Yeah. And so I'm glad to have that discussion. So I'm not trying to argue that what I just said right now would end the discussion, but I do think it needs to be framed that, it's for somebody who is like somebody like Paul Krugman or somebody, it can understand why to him it would be ridiculous. But for somebody who understands the serious problems with government provision of services in any other sector, that person, I think, really does need to carefully consider and really take seriously this critique. So you're right. Yeah, a standard argument that economists would give as to why something like military defense ought to be provided by the state and not left to the provision of the market is that they say, oh, this is a classic example of what's called a public good. And so, yes, something like protecting Americans from incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, that's the kind of thing where if one guy pays for it and the guy down the street doesn't pay for it, you can't really restrict the service to the guy who paid, right? And also by the same token, to protect the one guy from an incoming ballistic missile, if you protect the guy down the street from it also, it's not like it takes away the protection from the first guy. So these are as you say, these are the attributes, non-excludability and what's called non-rival consumption, that are the attributes of what's called the public good. And so economists think this is particularly difficult for the market to provide this kind of service because, private company, if enough people pay for it, well, to put up some kind of defense for missiles that are going to hit in a certain area, well, then why wouldn't the people in that area just realize, wait a minute, I'm going to stop paying because as long as enough of my neighbors pay, then, we'll still have that service. So there is an issue there. So do you want me to launch into what I think the answer to that is?
I would love to hear your answer because I think I think a lot of people would be like, I don't have an answer for that when they're arguing with non-libertarians.
Right. Okay.
So the minarchists, who you may want to convince them, the ones who are listening, and the anarchists, just to listen to a good argument. Sure.
So the first thing I would say is it's not as if with a lot of these things, I don't think it's correct to look at it and say, oh, there's just this threshold that we need we need this quote optimal level of funding, or that economists would say, yes, this is the Pareto efficient point, or that one that maximizes Kaldor-Hicks efficiency and so on. And because of the free rider problem and these public good nature of it, if funding is only 68% of that, then that's it. I don't think that's the right way to frame it. I think the issue is, in the real world, are you actually going to get better protection by giving a group of politicians the ability to monopolize, your defense? And so for example, I think in the United States right now, part of the reason we could be vulnerable to an outside attack is because of things that the U.S. government has done abroad, right? And so there's that sort of element too. And there's plenty of cases in general of governments using their standing armies not just to protect the population from foreign aggressors, but also to victimize their own people, right? So there's elements of that too you got to take into account. But let's just focus on this narrow economic issue. The primary mechanism that I see is what would happen in a modern, commercial society that's wealthy, is insurance companies would be the ones that would be funding really expensive defense operations. So look at a big city like Manhattan or Chicago. People own these skyscrapers, those things, you're talking about billions and billions of dollars of property there. And so there's like fire insurance you'd have. Hey, if there's a big fire, that could knock out stuff. So you have fire insurance, you have all kinds of stuff. And I think one of the provisions of these insurance contracts would say, what if the building is destroyed by an incoming enemy army? Or what if it's taken over by a foreign army and then the owners get indemnified? And so you're the insurance company now that's issued that contract, and you're collecting premiums saying, if our customers have their property destroyed or seized by foreign armies, we're going to compensate them according to some formula. Well, now that insurance company has an incentive to reduce the probability of that happening. And so they would be the ones, I think, that would place bounties. So some foreign army is massing on the border, then the insurance company, I think, would say, okay, and they would run numbers and figure out, okay, for any once they cross the border, any tank that somebody takes out, we will pay you $30,000. And if you knock out enemy infantry, we will pay you $500. They can, and those numbers wouldn't be arbitrary. That's where I'm coming from with the economic calculation stuff, because they could run the numbers and see, because they're the ones insuring the property. They could come up with some estimates about how much, for every tank that they take out, how much do we think that's saving us, and so on. So those numbers wouldn't be arbitrary. And then the private sector would be there, and they would, there'd be bounties on these things. And so that's where the funding would be. And then just like there's competition in other areas, and it produces better than a monopoly, same thing here, that if you didn't just have the government be the one in charge of the whole operation, but you had the whole private sector open to the idea of, hey, there's now prices for these things, go to it, guys. There'd be different ways of trying to do it. Some people would lay, mines. Some people would have snipers. Some people would get, shoulder missiles. Some people would have helicopters that would go. But there's different things they would do. All the eggs wouldn't be in one basket the way it is under a state-based defense operation. And I think that's the way it would play out. So let me just circle back as far as the free rider problem. So yeah, you could say that some aren't going to pay and some will. But notice there, I mean, if troops are massing at the border, like people, it's not going to be an equilibrium for everyone just to pay 0 cents and do nothing, right? So you can argue that, relative to some textbook outcome where the marginal benefit, marginal cost curves cross, this is the optimal level of funding. But in the real world, they're not just going to sit there and do nothing. They're going to pay for it. And I think the efficiencies of private provision would more than compensate for the fact that, yes, there might be some people who sit back and don't contribute and let their neighbors pay for it. But I think the defense there is still going to be a lot more efficient than giving the whole thing over to the government.
So you started to jump into the insurance side there, which I think is very important to this discussion. I agree with what you've written in your works and Hans Hoppe and Rothbard, that insurance would really have to play a major role in a stateless society. And for our listeners here, I mean, I think insurance kind of has this sort of caricatured or misunderstood role by many people, especially those on the left, but even on the right. I mean, but already insurance companies permeate business transactions around the world in ways that most people aren't even aware of. There's international business arbitration and errors and omissions insurance and bank insurance and all these kind of, and I'm not talking like FDIC, but private bank insurance, all these kind of things where insurance really holds up and facilitates trade of goods and services internationally right now that people just don't see. So can you get a little bit into that and talk to us about like the history of insurance, its intended purpose, and what role it plays in the market?
I think the fundamental purpose of insurance is when there's events that can strike a homogeneous population infrequently, but it's catastrophic when they strike. All right, so it's like if you get a large group of people and they're all susceptible to this particularly bad outcome that's devastating if it happens, but there's a small chance of it happening. And so instead of just having everybody in that group just sitting there and rolling the dice and hoping it doesn't hit them, but if it does hit them, oh, wow, that's devastating. The function of insurance is you take that small chance of a really bad outcome and you transform it into a certain chance of a quite manageable outcome. Namely, everybody pays a fixed premium, and then the insurance company indemnifies you fully, if the disaster happens to strike you. So this is stuff, like that's what life insurance is for, or term life insurance, at least for younger people. That, there's a small chance that, the young breadwinner, he's out, has a job, he's supporting his wife and 3 kids at home, and they're young and they have a mortgage, and it would just be catastrophic if that guy had a heart attack suddenly next week. And, you don't want them to be a burden on their relatives and whatnot, or the church or what have you. And so you just go get a life insurance policy, because, with a population of 1,000 households like that, you can, run the actuarial tables and so on and figure out, okay, how many are probably going to die. And so then, they just charge accordingly. So, I mean, it's sort of like, before there were things like mutual aid societies, or it was just sort of the social norms that the community in general, if that happened, so the young person, the hunter or somebody dies, then, the other families would sort of take care of the wife and kid or whatever, share. So, I mean, that principle is still there, that people can recognize, oh my gosh, that could have happened to any of us. It just happened to happen to them. So we all need to pitch in to help those people. Well, that's insurance just kind of formalizes that, makes it more the scientific, as it were, in terms of accounting. Same thing with fire insurance, car insurance, all these other areas. You're right. One thing too is like with medical insurance on the doctor's side, right? So medical malpractice insurance, so a similar thing there, where companies come in, and that's sort of in between the provider of the service and the customer, so that in case something goes wrong, the customer gets indemnified. And so I think in general, insurance would play a huge role in a free society. A lot of the stuff that right now people assume, you would need the state to regulate that stuff because just one-off transactions, you can't expect consumers to keep track of that. Like, for example, airlines, people think, there's got to be something like the FAA in the United States, because, you don't want it to be like that situation in that movie Rain Man, right, where you got to just know the statistics of every plane crash going back 30 years before you buy your ticket. Well, no, if you had insurance companies that would say to customers, if the plane happens to go down, then we will pay your estate $1 million, let's say. If that was a standard thing when you bought a ticket for an airline, that was just part of the contract, is that, if there's a crash, then your estate gets $1 million. Well, now, the insurance company that's making that pledge, that's backing that up, is going to be up to them to make sure that these airlines are doing a good job, right? And the pilots aren't getting behind the wheel drunk and stuff like that. And so it's the insurance companies that might have contracts with the airlines saying, we have the right to send our inspectors to show up for a surprise inspection and make sure you've been changing the oil and, keeping the plane up to speed, or we're going to stop and give a quick drug test to the pilot. So, and these would all be voluntary contracts, right? So that it would play out in the market. And so, I don't know exactly what would happen, but there would be a trade-off between various competing factors. And the point is, though, that the insurance company would have the incentives to really make sure we were in a good spot in that trade-off between, regulation versus keeping prices down for customers. So I think that, yes, in general, insurance plays a huge role in our lives, and a lot of people don't really understand that. And probably, unfortunately, the thing they think of most is like health insurance right now, and that doesn't seem to be working. But I would say, right, the area where the government is most heavily involved is screwing up that particular market. But most people, don't really have a problem with their car insurance. They just take that for granted. Hey, I got my car insurance.
Yeah, I think the perception, especially because of the health insurance, experience, we feel like the insurance companies sort of block the price mechanism from occurring in the medical industry. And so I think people have this bad perception of insurance. I mean, even John Stossel, he's a libertarian and he is pretty against insurance, doesn't seem to have an appreciation for it. Is it just people don't understand the nature of insurance? Why do you think that's kind of hard to get people to buy in on that? I realize people on the left aren't going to be too thrilled, but your Minocris and stuff, they don't see that as an important role.
Well, I think because in terms of our day-to-day lives, the only time we usually deal with insurance companies lately as Americans is when you're arguing with your health insurance company, right? Because I said, normally insurance by its very nature is something you would rarely use, right? So most people aren't getting in car accidents or having their house burned down or suddenly dying. And so, those are the times when the other types of insurance you have kick in. So yeah, if your house burns down and then your fire insurance company sends you a big check, you're not going to be like, oh man, I hate the principle or the concept of insurance. You're going to say, wow, I'm really glad I had insurance. Or you get in a car accident, what have you. So, I think, like I said, I'm just repeating myself, that the problem is that one type of insurance company people deal with a lot nowadays is their health insurance company. And that's because insurance in that sector has been perverted, right? It's to the point now where your health insurance company has something to say and participates in every single transaction related to medical care. And that would be like if every time you went and got your oil changed for your car, you called up your car insurance company and they were supposed to pay for it, or they made you pay $10 of it or something, and then they negotiated with the oil change place to negotiate on the price. I mean, that would be crazy. If that were the system, you'd probably hate your car insurance company too, right? And so that's the problem. I think that's why people have a bad taste in their mouth with insurance. But again, just consider that's not about insurance per se. That's about health insurance. And notice that clearly that's the one area of the insurance sector that is most heavily regulated by the government. So it shouldn't shock us, and it shouldn't be taken as like evidence against the market being able to work to say, oh yeah, when the government gets really heavily involved, it can screw up health insurance.
Bob, you're a little too modest to plug your own book on this show, but you do have a book about the health insurance racket, right?
Yeah, it's called the Primal Prescription, and it's co-authored with Doug McGuff, who is an ER medical doctor. So yeah, we go through and give a whole history of. So it's not just us saying, oh well, something's screwed up, so it must be the government. We don't really know how or specifically, but come on, we know the government did it. Like we go through, since the Great Depression onward, enlist all the various rounds of the government would intervene this way to fix this alleged problem, and then they caused these unintended consequences, and the government came back 10 years later with another wave, and just boom, boom, boom. So one quick example, like right now, part of the reason the health insurance system is so screwy is that, like you said, and I can see why somebody like John Stossel would be very skeptical of this. We've gotten to the point where American, the so-called customer in the health transaction, the patient is not really the customer anymore. He's like this annoying nuisance that bothers both the health insurer and the medical provider, right? Because the doctor doesn't really care about keeping the customer, the patient happy, because the doctor's getting paid by Blue Cross or getting paid by Medicare or some third party. It's not the customer who's writing a check saying, oh yeah, and if you're not good to me and you don't keep me happy, then I'm just going to go to the doctor down the street. That's not the way these markets are working lately. So one of the reasons for that, among others, is that a lot of Americans get their health insurance through their employer. Notice if you lose your job, you might say, oh geez, I can't get that elective procedure right now because I'm in between jobs and I don't have health insurance. But nobody says, yeah, I'd like to go to that party, Frank, but I can't drive because I lost my car insurance because I'm in between jobs right now, so I can't have car insurance. People don't even talk like that. That would be weird to think your car insurance had anything to do with whether you were in between jobs or not. But why is it that your health insurance is tied to your employer? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one is back during World War II, there were wage and price controls. And so one of the ways employers were allowed to bid talent away from other companies is the government said, yeah, you can't offer them more money. That's illegal. But if you want to offer them, that you'll pay for the premiums for their health insurance, you can do that. So that's one of the reasons that historically, we got into this rut.
Along these lines, I mean, now that we're kind of talking about health insurance and medical care, let's kind of dive into some specific controversial areas of things that people seem to think couldn't happen or happen well without the government. So things like public services, so ambulances, fire departments, utilities like your sewage and your electrical, all these things tend to be tied in somehow to the state, either because it's directly provided by the state or there's some kind of state-approved vendor or contractor who kind of has the crony deal going on that they're the only provider. What would that look like in, let's say, a large city if there was no state entity per se and everything was just going through private business?
Okay, sure. So let me just give the quick sort of like real world observation, and then we can talk more about the abstract theory that economists bounce around. But, it used to be when I was younger that there was just one telephone provider, telephone service. You just had your local monopoly and that was it. And people would give reasons for why that is. But now, of course, with cell phones, you get multiple providers, and then with the rise of the internet and, all those sort of internet-based services, and you can see that the prices came way down in those various plans, right? And so it's, that's just a real world example showing that competition can work in these areas. So the textbook reason that economists would give as to why, oh yeah, you need to have government heavy intervention in these areas, the things that you just listed there, is they say, oh, there's what's called a natural monopoly. And so the idea is, oh yeah, a free market, open competition wouldn't work with something like routing electricity to your house, because then, you would have 10 different companies and they'd have their own, they'd build their own wires and whatever in there, and that just would be impractical. And so there'd be mergers and so on. And eventually it would just make sense for one company to be, maintaining the wires in your neighborhood. And then there'd be a monopoly. And so they could charge you whatever they want, especially for something like electricity that's critical. And so the idea is, instead of just letting that natural monopolist take over and just, be a predator, instead we'll have the government come in and anoint a monopoly, but then, regulate their prices so that now if the power company wants to raise rates, they got to submit a proposal to the local government and get them to sign off on it before they're legally allowed to charge you more for your electricity. They have to show, well, look at, generation costs have gone up and population has grown, and we had to fix there was a storm last year that knocked down all these wires. We had to fix that. So here, and that's what they have to do to raise rates. So the problem with that is there's not just this fixed engineering fact about how much does it cost to provide electricity to households. And then, oh yeah, the government could just say you can charge that plus some small modest markup for your profit. That if you give that formula, that cost plus formula, now you've taken away any incentive for the utilities to innovate. They have no reason to find out some new way to provide the service at a lower price, because then they can't go to the rate makers and get an increase in rates, right? That whole point is they have to show that their costs have gone up in order to raise prices under the current formula. So I think that's the main flaw with that approach is it just locks in the current way of doing it, and there's very, very little innovation. So, in general, even if there's not competition, like going to a particular neighborhood, there's new housing developments springing up all the time. And so just nationally, if there are several companies that in different cities have market share, now if you're some builder and you're going to build 50 houses now in this new area, you could still put out bids to the people to come in and provide, wiring and so forth to bring in electricity to those households, right? And there could be several different competing companies. So it's this idea that there would be this one, brief 3-week span of competition, and from then on the natural monopolist would rule. That's crazy. That's clearly not how things would play out.
Well, and we could probably even comment here that we have to ask, what is the definition of a true monopoly, right? And I mean, Rothbard talks about this in his works. There's a difference between what you just talked about, a natural monopoly, where you have a business that simply because it's the best, it has the best quality or the lowest prices, and for whatever reason, consumers just choose to go there and puts all their competition out of business. I guess this is really more of an ethical question at that point, but I'd kind of say, great, don't we all want lower prices and more quality? But then there's usually when there's what we call a monopoly, it's because it's backed by the state somehow, right? There's some kind of cronyism involved, some sort of special protection through either a contract, a government contract, some type of legislation preventing competition, which is what the post office is, legalized monopoly. And we see this in public utility companies, all these kind of things. So can you just talk briefly about the distinction between a genuine monopoly where the state is backing it up through coercion and a natural monopoly where a business just happened to do better than its competition?
Okay, sure. So you're right. Rothbard that's one of the great things that he does in his book, Man, Economy, and State, which is and this is a part of what was an original contribution there. So a lot of what Rothbard did there was just sort of clarify and distill the ideas from previous economists in a very readable fashion, just to transmit the theory to the next generation of readers. But one of the things that was a unique contribution, as you just said, is his critique of the whole idea of monopoly price. And so you're right. Rothbard does a great job of just going through and saying, like, what do we even mean by that? Like, construed narrowly enough, everything is a monopoly, right? That, my services, if I'm going to go give lectures for, as an after dinner speaker, I'm the only one who can provide a lecture by Robert P. Murphy, so I'm a monopolist in that respect. Or, the heavyweight champ of the world is a monopolist, or Babe Ruth was a monopolist, right? And so in Rothbard saying at some point you realize, well, that's kind of silly. That's not really what we mean. And so you start going through and trying to understand what is it that people are worried about. And ultimately, you're right. He comes to the conclusion that there's no real coherent benchmark to say that really what the econ textbooks mean when they talk about a, quote, monopoly price is they mean as opposed to a so-called competitive price, where they have this hypothetical world where there's lots of sellers who are all selling identical products and that. But if those sellers don't exist, what's the point of holding up this allegedly, optimal benchmark of a perfectly competitive market where that doesn't exist? So a great example of that kind of stuff is like if there's some new product, right? Like some innovator comes in and they create some new thing and they're the first to rush it to market. And in the beginning, they don't have any competitors because they're the first one with this new product. And so, yeah, you could say maybe they're charging a higher price than they would if there were lots of sellers offering the same product. But that's not really relevant. The question is, do you want them doing that or not? And if they're not allowed to charge a high price, then maybe the incentive to innovate and to come up with new products is going to be reduced. So there's that whole realm. But back to the issue of, utility service or sewage services, things like that, phone service, perhaps. When I was using the term natural monopoly, that's from like textbook economic theory, and that has a specific meaning. So that doesn't just mean a monopoly that is not granted by special state privilege. There it means there's certain industries where the claim is that because of its nature, there's economies of scale or whatever, and it doesn't make sense for there to be 10 companies providing, the service of bringing water to your house in a certain area, because they each, the company has to have a pipe to get the thing from the pumping station to your house, or from the water tower to your house. And so it would be crazy if you had 10 different companies laying 10 different pipes side by side. That's not going to work. So they're going to say, because of economies of scale and mergers and so forth, when the dust settles, there's only going to be one company operating in any particular region if you just had left it up to pure market forces. And then the claim is that company would have a lot of market power over the houses in that region. And that's the textbook rationale for regulating that kind of a sector, rather than like regulating all the pizza joints in a certain town. Because the idea is, if one pizza joint's charging too much, they're charging way above the cost, some rival will open a pizza joint down the street. But the idea here is not, if a water company is charging households a pretty big markup, they would have to really be charging a huge markup before it made sense for a competitor to come in and lay their own pipes side by side to undercut them. And so the idea is that's the rationale, and that's what's called a quote natural monopoly. And so I just tried to, before talk about why I think that's kind of a silly critique, when you realize we're not talking about one neighborhood, end of story. There's new housing developments being built all the time, and companies can operate on a national scale. So even if it's true that one company only has the contracts for houses in this zip code or something, there's still plenty of healthy competition, for any time a new place opens up.
Some people's impulses might, as you're saying all those things, it's like, well, shoot, if we're going to expect a natural monopoly for reasons of efficiency, then what's the big deal having a local jurisdiction, carry my water to my house? I think people kind of think of a monopoly as bad because they just wish there were other choices. And some people will say, I don't have any choice and I got to pay my water and sewer and it's the only choice I have, whereas they can go to any pizza place they want. And I think people kind of shrug and say, well, I chose to live in this township and that was just part of my choice to live there. And it seems voluntary enough where it doesn't feel coercive in the sense that, a national federal government would. What would you say to those concerns?
Well, if I'm understanding what you're saying, the claim is, it's not really that big a deal. So certainly, if I have to choose between a monopoly that's imposed from Washington, D.C. on the whole country versus thousands of little monopolies imposed by, city or town governments just in the area where they have jurisdiction, obviously the latter's a better outcome, but that's partly because that's really less of an effective monopoly. And there is competition at the, city or county level or town level, between jurisdictions.
It doesn't feel like a big bad state.
Right. But that's sort of the logic of it, because if one particular city, really did have draconian regulations in play where they had a real crony deal with, look, in Flint, it's certainly the case there that the government's arrangements, in terms of providing water to the citizens, did not turn out so well. All right. So it's still true that, you ultimately, if you don't trust the government with mundane things like television and pizzas and stuff, why would you trust them with your drinking water? I think that's a valid thing to bring up. But the fact is, if they're really bad, technically, you can just move to another city. That's not nearly as hard as saying, if the federal government's bad enough, you can just leave the country. So that's all true. But I'm saying, because for the same reason that's right, even more so, then I would say, don't even give the city and local governments, the ability to have that monopoly. And so it's kind of odd. It's like, because we're worried that the market might have a quote natural monopoly, we're going to go ahead and impose that outcome at the outset through the government's coercive apparatus. So the reason we have a government-picked monopoly is to protect you from a private monopoly. That's what their argument is, and that seemed kind of silly.
Right, and we know that nobody's cousin sits on the board of those local townships who also has a construction company or a water company. That kind of thing doesn't happen ever, does it?
Right. And that you're kind of circling back to my original point or my main problem with the abstract level of the theoretical critique of this is that the approach this is because there'd be a quote natural market monopoly there where they would have a huge markup over the cost of providing electricity or sewage or drinking water or whatever. Therefore, why don't we just impose have the government pick some company and strictly regulate it for cost plus? The fundamental problem with that in terms of just economic theory is that it's getting rid of the discovery mechanism, right? That it isn't just a fact of nature. How much does it cost to, take care of sewers or something for a neighborhood. That's not just a fact of engineering. It's dependent on, the companies and what their incentives are. And so if you have competition, then they're going to, they can't be too lazy about it, right? If they let their costs get out of control and they charge a lot, then there is ultimately scope for some competitor to come in and undercut them, or at least when there's a new development being built adjacent to that, some outside company can say to that housing developer, whoa, I'll come in at 20% lower than what these clowns are charging you because I've looked at their operation over here and they're pretty lazy and sloppy. We can do the job better. So you're going to minimize the damage at the very least if you have it's all private. So even if some company does rest on its laurels, they're eventually going to go out of business. Whereas, if the government's literally anointing a company as the monopolist and everybody in the city has to go to that company, then they can get away with a lot of waste.
Well, it sounds like you've really thought a lot about all of these things because you have all kinds of answers. So I want to throw one thing that you've probably never heard a libertarian wonder about or a minarchist wonder about. What about the roads?
Well, it's funny here. I mean, especially now with modern technology, like with, Easy Pass and those things, it's really amazing to me that this is still this huge stumbling block for people. So coincidentally, in July, I'm going to have an Econ Lib, so econlib.org. One of the featured articles of the month, assuming that I'm still in the queue for that, is going to be on this very topic. So, I mean, here, look, there's historically roads were privately produced, right? Like turnpikes and things. Like those were like when they, originally they had like dirt roads or something. And then the merchants in a town would realize, hey, if we could pave these things and just make it easier for people to come and go, that would boost, traffic coming into and patronizing our businesses. And so you might get all the big merchants in a populous area to kick in and to pave, what was previously just a dirt road or something. So, the market can provide this stuff. And now more modern times, look, the huge problem with roads right now is traffic jams, right? And especially like in major cities. I mean, there's estimates if you take into account like all the people's time and how valuable their time is. Just think of something like New York City or LA. You've got all these professionals who might, would bill their clients hundreds of dollars an hour, and they might lose 3 to 4 hours a day just sitting in traffic, coming and going from the office. I mean, it adds up to billions of dollars in terms of forfeited productivity. And so why is that happening? That's not a fact of nature. That's, there's a lot of people, so of course you're going to be stuck in traffic. No, that's because the roads are owned by the government and they don't charge enough. That's a shortage where the demand exceeds the supply. That's what it looks like in the context of transportation. So if those things were privatized, then they would set tolls based on usage, and so you do see this in certain cities right now anyway. It's just they don't do it enough. So it is true, like in New York, to use the bridge to come into the city, you pay more if you're doing it, during prime time than if you do it at 11 o'clock at night. But I'm just saying they would let the market mechanism work even more so if you had private ownership. And then because they would do that, and they would be making boatloads of money during peak, prime time, then there'd be the incentive. Other entrepreneurs would come in and they would build a lot more bridges and tunnels and so on to get people in and out of the city. So, again, just leaving a service in the hands of the government, why anybody thinks that's a good idea and that's the way to keep costs down and that's the way to provide service to poor people. I mean, it just shocks me that that's what people think.
On Facebook, I see a lot of things come through my feed where Elon Musk is coming up with all these, brilliant ideas about things. And, setting aside the fact that he, any sort of cronyism on the part of Tesla or whatever, I'm not really sure. But setting aside that fact, it does seem like people are more interested in innovative ideas that don't come from government in this particular area. Things like solar panel roads and, roads that, warm up in the winter so that, that you don't have ice, so it's safer and things like that. So it seems like people are warming up to this area, ironically, to be a little bit more, innovative.
Yeah, and one of the things Walter Block points out, so for people are curious, you just Google Walter Block private roads. He's got like a collection of essays on this stuff. This is one of the areas where he's written a lot over the decades. And I don't have the figures at my fingertips right now, but I mean there are thousands and thousands of people who die every year on roadways, And his point is, if this were something that were managed by the private sector, there would be outrages. There'd be congressional investigations and stuff. And why are you so? But now it's just like taken for granted. Oh yeah, people die, and they blame it on the driver. And so I think if you had competition and roads were primarily owned, by private owners, that there would be, much more attention paid to road safety. And so, like right now, if there's some real dangerous intersection where, like per capita or whatever, man, a lot of people seem to die at that intersection, even, compared to other roads nationally. The incentive, it's not like the mayor of that city is going to lose the next election race because of that intersection where more people die than really statistically ought to happen. You know what I mean? So just as the incentives of fixing the roads, whereas if it were privately owned, I think the incentives would be there. And if like your business was just maintaining road, you were the company that designed the road intersections or whatever, and it was always put up for by private people who paid for your services, and they looked at your repertoire, they looked at your portfolio and said, yeah, I see here that last year you built this intersection, and right now this is the one place in the United States where more people died than any other one. I don't think I'm going to let you design my intersection for my road, for my housing development. So I think you would see that. Last thing I'll say on this, we take it for granted about how roads ought to be designed, and I think people just consider, oh, well, can we imagine private companies doing exactly the way the government does it right now, except they would be charging instead of, paying through gas taxes and stuff. But, you got to think outside the box, to use the cliche. For all we know, the current design is totally wrong. I mean, there's innovative people over in Europe that are trying things like one guy's whole rationale or motivation is he thinks that anytime you put up a sign as a road engineer, that's a sign, no pun intended, that you failed, because he thinks you're trying to like force the outcome. So he designs intersections and things with traffic circles and whatnot without signs, without lights or anything. And so the motorists approaching that, they're a little bit confused. And so what do? They slow down and they really pay attention. And so there's no accidents. And there's this video, I saw this one guy where he was talking to a reporter, explained his concept, and they came up to this intersection that he had designed, and he turned around and walked backwards into the traffic to show how confident he was that the drivers were all going to be very alert, and they just swarmed around him. And it looked like a theatrical performance or something, but it was a great demo. Whereas right now, no one who designs an interstate highway system is going to turn around and walk backwards out on I-40 or something. He'd be dead. So just showing you the way things are done. Well, yeah, there's been a government monopoly for a long time, and if we had genuine competition in these things, I think there'd be a lot of experimentation, and maybe we would see that, oh yeah, the way people design roads right now in the United States is kind of silly.
We touched on this a little bit earlier, but kind of the last bastion, if you will, for people in accepting anarcho-capitalism or even being open to this kind of thinking has to do with defense, policing, and essentially the law itself. So let's kind of move into that and talk about why would defense services and police services be better provided by a pure market? So, I mean, some of the objections people might come up with are, okay, we don't have a military anymore. It's all private contractors. How is that going to protect us if, China invades or something like that? And if everything is private policing, are we going to have these private police agencies shooting at each other on the streets to protect their customers, or themselves trying to become a new state, essentially like a warlord of sorts? How would you address those objections?
Okay, sure. So I think actually, conceptually, the real challenge for someone who's trying to imagine a free society that's based just on voluntary relationships and there's no, coercion that's deliberately imposed institutionally, I think conceptually it's the legal system is the thing that's really hard to imagine. Like if you just stipulate for the moment that we've solved that problem and you could have a free society where there is a rule of law and everybody knows who owns what, if you already have that problem solved, then providing military defense, I think, is actually pretty straightforward. So the model there, just what I alluded to earlier, where I think you'd have insurance for really big ticket things, funding, who's going to pay for tanks and surface to air missiles and long range bombers and things like that. I think it would be insurance companies. And then all that stuff would happen though under the framework of a rule of law. So that's, if some particular, the company that makes tanks, if people start getting nervous about, well, gee, they're making a lot of extra tanks and they're starting to shake down people. Like they're showing up and saying, yeah, it'd be a shame if something happened to your property. Maybe you should subscribe to our protection services. And they're starting to turn more into a crime group. Everybody would know they were acting criminally, right? Because these things would all be separated. The same company wouldn't be making tanks and being in charge of the court system and wouldn't have the judges on the same payroll, right? The way that right now the state kind of takes care of all those functions. And so at the very least, if one company started crossing the line and wasn't really voluntary anymore and was starting to get coercive, at least that would be obvious to everybody and the legal system would rule it as such. And so you'd be able, I think, to nip it in the bud a lot earlier, and there'd be different companies, right? So it would be different agencies. It's not that the company that sold tanks to or maintained the tanks to protect LA would be the same one that provided the tanks to protect New York. And so in terms of worrying about this group taking over and oppressing everybody the way the current federal government takes 20-30% of our income every year, it would be hard for that to happen. There'd be petty little groups, and if any one of them started getting on the line, there'd be 99 competitors there that could, that its customers could turn to. Whereas right now, if you think the U.S. federal government is treating you unfairly, there's not too much you can do about it. So there's that element. So I'll stop it if you want to push back against that. But I think that, we haven't talked yet about how would a private legal system work, which I think is just a quantum leap harder in terms of understanding. But if you stipulate the private legal system for the moment, I actually think private defense isn't that big a deal.
I would agree with that. So I agree with your assessment that is fundamentally the issue. So let's talk about that. So right now we have instances where, states, the state by definition basically is an institution that has a monopoly on law and violence in a given geographic area, right? So let's say if we didn't have that, we didn't have any states, all we had are businesses, pure market. Who makes the rules? And as you're traveling around, how do you know what legal system you're in, and how do you prevent it from becoming arbitrary? And who actually makes the final decisions? Because at some point there has to be some type of authority where your appeal, whether that's in a court or a transaction or whatever, is final, and there's no more appeal. How do we resolve that in a private law system?
Okay, so I think the first thing to realize is that law existed before legislation existed, like in terms of human history. So humans knew there were things that were crimes before humans thought, the king or the chief or a group of experts can tell us these are the list of laws pertaining to this region. All right, so people knew it was a crime to kill somebody just because you were jealous of his wife or something, or just because you wanted his cow, you could just go bash his head in with a rock. People knew that was wrong and a crime before they knew that, yes, there's some mechanism by which a small subset of us get to tell us the rules that guide our behavior. All right, so the idea of legislation. So this is the distinction between law and legislation that Hayek stressed it, and a lot of classical liberal thinkers stressed it. So I want to make sure people see that it's a more recent invention where humans, I think, had the arrogance or the hubris to think that, we can remake the rules governing society, and nothing, that's not going to blow up in our face. That's fine. So there's that element. And so in any particular group of people, there is going to be this general view of the things that are property in terms of the vocabulary that we would use. They would know, for example, you own your body, okay, and so that's going to be pretty shared. And so that's why somebody can't just come up and punch you in the face or enslave you. That people would realize that that's sort of the default position. They would know, the people who have been living in that house for 30 years, that's their house. It's not the house of the person who just walks up to it one day and says, this is mine. So there'd be these primitive underlying things. And now, what role would judges serve in that kind of framework? Well, they would render opinions. Like even right now, that's the language we use, right? What does the judge do the judge writes an opinion. And so what the judge really is doing is that he's an expert in the law. And so when two people have a dispute and they each claim that, no, the law is on my side in this case, they go to the judge and the judge issues an opinion saying, I apply the law to these particular facts in this way. So in my opinion, the law comes down either on the side of the plaintiff or the defendant in this particular case. So the judge isn't making the law, the judge is interpreting and applying the law. So it's like I'm describing the sort of common law framework. And so in that system, the two parties who go before the judge are both agreeing to it. They're consenting. They're saying, we can't work this out on our own. We have this disagreement. We both think we're in the right legally. So let's go to this judge and see what this person says. And so they're going to go to the judge who has a reputation for expertise in that particular area of the law in the community. So, I'm sure you can come back and you bring up the hard cases in a second. And I'm happy to deal with those. But I think people need to just realize that the baseline general case, day in, day out, 99% of the cases that judges are going to hear are going to be people who have, generally similar views about what the law is and what applies to their particular circumstances. And I think that would be the majority of the issue. So now for cases where, that's not the case, you can have pre-existing arrangements. And so if you're an employer and you're going to deal with some employee who has a radically different value system from you, then part of probably what you're going to specify in the employment contracts, not just, okay, you got to show up for work at this time, you're going to have this much vacation, I'm going to pay you this amount, I'm going to give you these benefits. But also, if we have a dispute, then we agree to settle it through arbitration with, this agency over here using this particular legal code. All right. So, if some devout Muslim's going to go work for an Orthodox Jew, they might, need to come up with some kind of arrangement. So I think with a lot of these things, even where they have their own, what they think is the right kind of legal code, if you're dealing with somebody who has a radically different one, then as much as possible, you would want to specify that up front. So it's true. You could say, well, yeah, but isn't there still going to be overlap? Which you have that right now. So, but I guess what I'm getting at is just saying, well, let's have a state. That doesn't solve the logical problem, right? To just say, oh, you know what? In the geographical region of the United States right now, actually, the people have different views about abortion. Is that murder? Different views about, well, suppose somebody, is a serial killer and we catch him. Do we just have to keep him, locked up till he dies, or can we kill him? Can we torture him for 3 days and then kill him? Right? People have different views on that. And we can talk about, how would a private legal system handle those different views. But my point is, by just saying, oh, let's have a state impose a monopoly, you haven't all of a sudden made everyone have the same opinion. You've just now pushed the problem back to elections. And so now people who have different views on abortion hate each other's guts, and they argue about who the president's going to be and who he's going to put on the Supreme Court. So it's not that we've solved these underlying disagreements. And I think in a voluntary framework, the hostility and conflict would be minimized and people would organize into different regions, that had similar views. And so, if you're dealing with somebody who had your shared legal framework, that's the way it would be decided. So I'll stop there. I know I've been talking a while and let you guys push back, but it's critical, I think, to say, yeah, these hard issues of people having vastly different views about what the law should be, you don't solve that problem and make them all agree just by having an election every 4 years.
Yeah, you kind of touched on what I think would be the major objection that someone who is not an anarcho-capitalist might have is, if you have somebody who's just like a street thug who's just like, I'm going to rob you and kill you, and I don't recognize any legal system. How do you deal with that kind of a person? And yeah, I'm just sort of giving friendly pushback here because I agree with where you're coming from, but I'm putting myself in the mindset of somebody who maybe is just they're sympathetic to anarcho-capitalism, but they just can't quite get to that point on how do you deal with that kind of person, especially because as Christians, we recognize there's a sin nature, right? People are fallen, there's sin, and not everybody's just going to sing Kumbaya all the time. So what do you do with those really extreme cases where you have somebody who's just determined to kill you?
Sure. And I'm sure you guys know this, but yeah, it's precisely because I'm a Christian that my perspective on this is even bolstered. I'm even more confident in the stuff I'm saying, that you don't want to give this tremendous power to a small group of people precisely because of their fallen nature. You couldn't put, if men are evil, you don't want a small group of them having all the nuclear weapons and be in charge of the prisons. That's crazy. So the way I handle this, and this, I haven't had anybody explicitly say this is wrong or whatever, but I just do want to say this is sort of my idea. So either I should be patted on the back if you think it's good, or I should be blamed if you think it doesn't work out. But I think we don't actually need to say, like, by what right do we have to have some, defense agency go grab some guy against his will and put him in a van and drive him to some place and put him behind bars and hold him there as a hostage or a prisoner. And people try to come up with the justification, because the problem, if you have a system where you can spin out property rights, like Rothbard does it in The Ethics of Liberty. Hans Hoppe has lots of essays and things where he tries to, from scratch, develop the libertarian framework. I think probably Stephan Kinsella has demonstrations like this, and those are fine. But the thing is, when somebody violates those rules, it gets tricky. And so Rothbard, has a principle like saying, if somebody violates property rights, then you're allowed to do to him, the same thing he did. So some guy steals your TV, you can get your TV back and you can steal his TV, but you can't shoot him in the head, right? So there's that kind of issue. So it limits the amount of retaliation that you can do. But even that's a little bit arbitrary. And also it doesn't do stuff like, if some guy's a sadomasochist and he comes and abuses you, and then you get to abuse him twice back. I mean, that's kind of weird, but also he might like it, So there's weird stuff like that where it's not clear that this principle makes much sense outside of things like theft of physical property. So where I'm coming from is say, fortunately, I don't think we really need to deal with that too much, because let's say, there's some guy going around who's an axe murderer or whatever. Clearly, we can all agree that property owners have the right to say, I don't want you on my property, get off my land. And they can, eject you from their land, regardless of who you are. And so if there is a guy that the legal system has determined, in the reputable courts, and various judges have all signed off on it, and yep, this guy, he's an axe murderer and he's a fugitive, then, it could just be a standard thing that all the property owners in this geographical region would just say, this guy is not welcome on our land. And if we see him, we are going to eject him. And so that my point is, it's not so much that we have to worry about, do we have the legal right to go physically grab some guy because he's a murderer and then go hold him in a place? And how long do we get to hold him? And can we torture him? Is that no, just every landowner would be saying, get off my land. And you're allowed to say that clearly. And then I think what the analog of prison would be in this kind of a framework is there would be some companies that would realize, okay, at any given time, there might be like 100 people like that in our big society who are totally outlaws and fugitives. And they're just going to be pushed to the perimeter and starved to death because no one wants them on their land. And we'll offer refuge to them. We'll have secure walls, and when they show up at our door, we'll search them for weapons, and we'll have complicated procedures to make sure our employees are safe and whatever. But we'll say, you can come in here, and we'll provide room and board, and we'll give you a workstation if you're like an engineer, just you're really violent, you kill people or whatever, but you can work here. We're not going to have you do something dumb like making license plates. We'll have you doing something as productive as possible, given the constraints on your physical movement. And so these prisons would be like competing with each other. They'd be like hotels or with a lot of strict limits on your movement. And once you went in there, the surrounding regions would say, okay, but these people can't leave and come onto our property. So that, to me, that's the way you would handle these really hard cases of just some guy who's crazy going around killing people with an axe. Is that technically, legally, what would be happening is all the property owners would say, get this guy off my land. It's not that they'd say he's an axe murderer and therefore you have the right to kidnap him. Instead, they would just be saying, I want him off my land. He's not leaving. Remove him. So if everybody is saying that except these 12 places that offer refuge, the agency could say to the guy, we're pushing you off everyone else's land. Where do you want to go? And he would pick the most reputable one or something. So that's kind of, I know that I'm leaving a lot of loose ends there, but in the context of our conversation here, that I'll stop there.
It's okay that you don't go into it, because we'd be here for hours, of course, and you've given us a lot of resources to go look into. We do want to ask a couple things. Libertarians, of course, don't care anything about the poor, but for the three progressives who might be listening, we probably should talk about how would this society, and by the way, that was sarcasm, how would this sort of society provide for, if you will, the needs of those who can't afford the kinds of things that we're talking about everybody's going to be just paying for out of pocket?
Sure. And believe it or not, I actually think the biggest change would be in the welfare, in the sense of well-being, not like government welfare checks, of the disadvantaged. Okay, so I don't think billionaires right now are the ones who are being particularly oppressed by the state. I think it is the people who are born in the inner city and whatever in the United States, or certainly, especially in foreign countries, like they're the ones that are really bearing the brunt of the oppression of the state right now, and bearing the full fruit of its operations. So, getting rid of things like the drug war, getting rid of compulsory school attendance rules that force young people to sit there in really horrible government schools where they literally might not be physically safe, and they're certainly not learning very much. I mean, getting rid of the minimum wage, a lot of these things, if you know standard economics from a free market perspective, you can see why, oh yes, that would transform the inner city. There wouldn't be drive-by shootings if you legalize drugs. People would be able to go out and get a decent job and start earning money, and so they wouldn't end up joining gangs and things like that. So I think, we shouldn't just take it for granted that, oh yeah, there's this huge population in the United States right now that's living on the verge of starvation, and thank goodness the government is there sending them food stamps. That no, the government is, depending on how conspiratorial you are, you either say wittingly or unwittingly, is the one that's keeping them in that position of dependence. And so I think that they would be a lot better off. And the other thing too is the state does not create resources through redistribution. It's the opposite. They squander resources. So it's not like there would be, if we had a free society, there'd be a lot more money in the hands of the productive people to be able to use through genuine philanthropy to help those who really needed it. And I think so there'd be more to go around, and it would be better targeted going through voluntary institutions designed to help the poor, who really would have incentive to get them back on their feet and get them off dependency. Whereas government agencies that hand out relief, it's actually in their interest to multiply the number of recipients, because then they can ask for a bigger budget. So, the people in charge of food stamps, actually, I'm not saying any individual, is thinking this, plotting at night, how can I make more people hungry? But in terms of the logic of expanding your operation, in terms of the government, budgets and so on, you don't want to solve the problem that you're in charge of. You want to just facilitate it.
Right. They're not trying to work themselves out of a job.
Right. And again, it's not that I'm saying any particular person who happens to be working in those bureaucracies, has any ill intent, but it's, again, the incentives are different. If it's, you're some private church who out of the general collection also has, takes some of that money to provide, soup or something to the people, the homeless people in your city, they really do want those people. They would like it if all of a sudden, over time, they transitioned all those people and got them jobs or got them into, treatment or whatever, and they stopped showing up for soup because they didn't need it anymore because they had a job. That would be great. And the church would spend its money on, sending missions to Africa or something. But again, the government agency in charge of sending out food stamps, they would, like you said, they would all lose their jobs if the problem actually got solved.
Well, in summary of that, it sounds like you're saying that in a genuine free market with stable property rights where people respect it, the market success, if you will take care of the poor, and then the successes of others will allow them to be charitable and truly take care of the poor rather than outsourcing it to a state.
Yeah, so it's a two-pronged thing. The first thing is just the moral issue, that if you're saying point blank, forget all your pragmatic arguments and whatever, just if it comes down to it, suppose, the choice is we take money from these wealthy people at gunpoint in order to give money, give that money to some person who's hungry so he can go buy food. Is that moral? If you're backing me into a corner, I'm going to say, no, that's not moral. That's stealing. And you're not allowed to steal even if you plan on doing something noble with the money. If you're so concerned about those poor people, then you give your money or you do a public campaign to get enough people to donate. But no, you can't use guns to go take money from people against their will to give to poor people. So, there's that moral issue. But also, yeah, pragmatically, I do think you're actually not helping poor people in the long run, that you're just stifling, private philanthropy, because people like with Ebenezer Scrooge, right? That people are saying, no, I'm not going to contribute that much to these voluntary efforts because the government taxes me like crazy for food stamps and all this stuff and welfare payments and what have you. So public housing, no, I'm not going to pay more. I don't need to. The government's taking care of that. So if you got rid of all that stuff, people in the private sector would have a lot more disposable income. And then they would realize, oh no, the government, there isn't this state agency that's allegedly taking care of these people. It's up to us. And so, yes, I think you would see more donations, but also the donations would be more effective.
As we kind of close out by talking about implementation here, one of the objections that I've heard many times, and I'm sure many of our listeners have heard, is, well, if all this anarcho-capitalism stuff really works so great, why hasn't it been tried more throughout history? And there's different pushback we could put up against that. I mean, we could talk about how statelessness is really the natural condition of human society. We could talk about how already the overwhelming majority of legal and business conflicts are resolved through private arbitration. We could talk about how the oceans don't have an international governing body. They're governed under maritime law, which is essentially private law. Outer space is governed under essentially a kind of recognized common type law. And even nation states themselves. We don't have a world government. Nation states fundamentally are engaged in a semi-anarchic system insofar as they don't have a single world ruler. So those are all kind of pushback we could give against that. But my question is, practically speaking, here we are in 2017, how would we transition into that type of a system, especially when we're surrounded by nation states that wouldn't be making the transition along with us? How would that work?
That's a great question, and I don't know what the right answer to that is. I think that in terms of all these other objections people are bringing up and so on, stuff like how would there be private roads? To me, that's silly. I can't believe that somebody who otherwise knows the benefits of the free market, how they could doubt that private business would be able to figure out how to pave a road from point A to point B and make money doing it. Clearly business would figure out a way to do that. That's not an issue. But yeah, the question when you say why, why is it that if this is so great? Because it's not just that I'm claiming, oh yeah, on the margin, people would be 12% better off. No, I mean, I think it would you couldn't even imagine how prosperous, and it's not just a matter of material prosperity, but just the outrages of, people getting killed, like just the stuff we see all the time in the United States about, police officers using excessive force and then getting acquitted of it. And, whether you think those are the right decisions or not in those particular cases, under a private framework like I'm talking about, the company, it's not just that there'd be, it's the police or nothing, the way it is right now. And people, rush to defend the police. Oh, when someone's breaking into your house, I guess you're not going to call 911, right? Because you complained about that cop who was too rough with that teenager. That's not the issue. If in any given area, there were 12 different companies that provided, defense service or police services or whatever term you want to use, and if one of them happened to have a history of, geez, it seems like your officers a lot of times, your employees, they wouldn't call them officers, use excessive force, well, then the merchants and whatever, the homeowners association would switch to the competitor, right? So it would minimize the problem. Whether that, in a particular instance, that person was convicted of a homicide or manslaughter will not be the issue. The company that routinely didn't provide proper training and didn't do enough background checks and hired people who were kind of violent or whatever, they would go out of business, right? So given that I'm thinking this free society I'm imagining would just be so much more livable and, full of happy, prosperous people, it is kind of odd to say, okay, well, why hasn't that happened? They would just need to be tried somewhere once and then it would work. And wouldn't that be a model for the world? And so I'm confessing, I don't know exactly what the explanation there is. I guess for one thing I can just say is, the enemy has done a good job of persuading people to tolerate these horrible, systems of injustice that they live under. And I think it's an issue. I know it sounds cliched, but of education in the sense of, hey, you got to free your mind, man, and then the rest will follow, right? I think fundamentally, if you say, why is it in the United States that people still live under this oppressive government that takes so much of their income every year, plunges their, young men and women into these foreign wars and so on that don't even keep us safe? I would say it's just because they've been convinced that it's the only way and that they really just can't conceive of an alternative. And the few places where states do break down, like in Somalia or whatever, that's not because everyone read Rothbard and saw the light. It's because the state became so corrupt and decrepit, it just kind of collapsed under its own weight and devolved into battling warlords. And so that's what people associate and say, oh yeah, we've seen what happens when the state disappears. But that's just an example where the state got so bad it collapsed temporarily. That's not really a good assessment of what happens if in the U.S., given our value system and prosperity and degree of peace with our neighbors, we just decided to stop using coercion on each other. What would happen then? That's a far different thing from saying, what if the state became so tyrannical it actually, cannibalized itself and collapsed for 3 years?
Well, there is a whole lot to think about in the time we spent together today, and we could probably keep going on and on our outline. We have plenty of things we wish we would have had time to ask you. Bob, thanks for being part of the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys, and I'm really glad you exist and you're filling a niche, that's for sure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you'd like to reach out to us and ask a question or submit some feedback, you can reach us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, and if you'd like to give us some support, you can go to libertarianchristians.com/donate. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. The audio engineers were Doug Stewart and Jason Rink, and voiceovers were by Matthew Bellis and Caitlin Horn. If you'd like to find out more about the LCI, please visit us on the web at www.libertarianchristians.com.